Welcome to Speedrunner Reviews. In this series I analyse games using the mindset of speedrunning and look at the game from three perspectives. First, the casual experience, which is how most people first play the game. Next, the speedrun experience, including all the interesting tech and how well the game holds up as a speed game. And finally, the tool-assisted speedrun, showing what the game looks like when pushed to the theoretical limit. If you already know the game and want to jump straight to the speedrun part, I've left timestamps in the description and chapters on the video. And today we're looking at Golden Axe Warrior for the Sega Master System. Now, right off the bat, we do have to address the elephant in the room. This game's a Zelda clone, right? It's basically Zelda 1, but for the Master System. I'd like to say there's some other big twists to the game, but aside from just some mechanics behaving differently, yeah, it's pretty much Zelda 1. Now, I know that can put a lot of people off, but from my perspective, it's like, well, if you enjoyed Zelda 1, here's a brand new Zelda 1 with all like different dungeons and everything, and it's almost like you can play this game and you're playing Zelda 1 again for the first time. Interestingly, there's this other game called Golvellius on the Master System, which a lot of people compare to Zelda 1, I guess because this one's more well known than Golden Axe Warrior. This always frustrates me because this game is quite different and I think it's an unfair comparison. Whereas Golden Axe Warrior basically is just Zelda 1. I'll also mention it took me quite a while to actually get into playing this game. Golden Axe is traditionally like a beat 'em up series, which doesn't interest me heaps, and I was looking for RPGs. I didn't actually realize this was an RPG from the name until I was looking up like lists of Master System RPGs. So that could have been a factor into why it didn't do as well. Maybe people just thought it was a different genre than what it actually was. I'll also mention that maybe because this game didn't do so well, it's gotten pretty rare, and also because it's quite good, it's gotten very expensive. So if you want to get your hands on a copy, it can be pretty tricky to do this. Just be aware of that if you're looking to play it. Now, I guess one of the most striking differences you will notice immediately is that the graphics take a pretty big step up in Golden Axe Warrior. Compare that to something like Zelda 1 and you can pretty much immediately see the difference. Now, yes, Golden Axe Warrior came out about 5 years later on the Master System, but it is on similar hardware, and it really goes to show just how powerful the Master System is. One really cool example of graphics is turning this fire into ice with the ice spell. Not to mention, it's really fun to just ring the ice spell heaps on the overworld. This game also has these magic spells, which is probably some of the best graphics you'll see on the Master System. I'm always so impressed when this one comes out. Now, don't get me wrong, I'll be the first person to tell you that graphics don't really matter that much, and it's much more important how well a game plays. But if graphics are the kind of thing that matters to you, it is pretty clear that Golden Axe Warrior has some pretty darn good graphics, especially compared to Zelda 1. And in general, it really just goes to show how powerful the Master System is and how successful it maybe could have been. I think part of the big issue with the Master System is that it didn't have as many developers wanting to make games for it, maybe because the NES had taken much more of a foothold, especially in the US. But there were some really good hidden gems on the Master System like this, and if it maybe had a bit more quantity, it could have done a little bit better as a console. Now, speaking of gameplay, I want to talk some quality of life improvements over Zelda 1. One really good thing about this game is that, well, you have the axe weapon and you can just chop down bushes. You don't need to like burn a bush, leave the screen, come back, try and burn a different bush. You just axe and you like slash away at all the bushes and see what happens. The other thing in Zelda 1 is sometimes you have to use bombs to find the secrets. There is a mechanic kind of like this in Golden Axe Warrior. You have to use this earth magic to get rid of blocks, but that's usually a lot more telegraphed than what it is in Zelda 1, and you're not going to waste all your bombs just like bombing literally everything in sight. That's one thing I found very frustrating in Zelda 1 is I would just run out of bombs if I was actually looking for secrets. Generally in this game, you're going to find secrets by killing all the enemies in a room or pushing one of the candles on a wall, or like chopping down trees and stuff on the overworld. The other cool mechanic in this game is how you fight enemies. You have this axe weapon pretty early on, and it's quite good. It sort of slashes in an arc, so you don't necessarily hit the enemies right in front of you. But then once you got used to that, you get an upgrade to your sword, and all of a sudden your sword is better than the axe. Now you've got a little trade-off to make. Do you want to fight with the axe and have more range on your attacks, or do you want to fight with the sword and do more damage? So it makes for a pretty cool trade-off there. I also mentioned this game has the whole magic system, which you can use as well, so you get projectile magic, one that freezes enemies, and then a couple more others in the late game. That fire magic that I showed before was an example of it as well. Now, generally you're better off using this green magic scroll which freezes enemies. That seems to be one of the most effective ones. Because the magic doesn't have very high damage output, it's kind of hard to use it to kill enemies, although with one shot of your magic you can freeze an enemy and pretty much just kill it straight away. The game also has some pretty cool boss fights here, they're always lots of fun. Now you can't always do this with a boss, but what you can actually do with some of them is stand in the doorway there. The boss can't damage you while you're in the doorway, but you can just keep sort of attacking at it, and then that makes these boss fights quite easy. But luckily not every boss is like that, otherwise this game may get a little bit boring. Now there are still bits about this game that annoy me, like these enemies here, the crabs. They don't look bad at all, they're very unlikely to hit you, but if they do, they rust your armor, and then all your defense basically goes away until you find a shop and buy magic oil. So at that point it's probably best to just like purposely reset or whatever you want to do. But yeah, it's kind of an unfortunate aspect of the game. And you've also got these rooms that sort of go dark as you go through them. Now there is an item that you can get that will light up these rooms, but really in a speedrun you want to avoid that, and it kind of makes it a bit annoying to play through these ones. The other thing is, in the final dungeon, a lot of the rooms just rely on you having to kill all the enemies in the room. And while that's fine as a mechanic, they do start to overdo it just a little bit. So the last dungeon actually drags on and takes a reasonably large percentage of the game, all things considered. I think maybe one of the weirdest choices is how dungeons end. It fills up your life and everything, but it doesn't spit you back to the start of the dungeon. It sort of just lets you walk back to the start, and to be honest, it's often just better to die if this happens. Dying will put you back on 3 health, and it will take half of your currency, which is the horns in this game, but usually it's faster than walking back to the start. Also, you can get back to the start of the world map by doing that, or wherever you last saved. This game does have a few more like NPCs and stuff than Zelda does, and to my understanding there's a lot of like Golden Axe series lore buried underneath this, but I haven't really played much of those games so I don't understand it too much. Also, from what I can gather, the translation's actually quite good in this game, no more weird cryptic hints like in Zelda 1. I think the good thing about this game though is it's not too cryptic. This bit here is maybe one of the worst bits where you have to use the ice spell to get that tree. But compared to like a Zelda 1, you probably could get through this one without a walkthrough. Although I would recommend at least having a map or something to avoid yourself getting pretty frustrated. Overall, definitely give this game a try. If you're unfamiliar with the Master System library and want to try something good, this one's pretty dang good. It might just be expensive if you want to buy a physical cartridge. Alright, now we'll move on to talking about the speedrun. I was one of the, I guess, pioneers of this game, sort of getting a 1:11 time way back in the day, but since then Quorbit has taken it to great new heights and optimized my time way more than I ever could. Now, not only did Quorbit optimize the time a lot more, Quorbit also put together this really good any percent guide here. So it just goes into so much about what's involved in the run, not to mention gives you maps for how to handle all the dungeons and everything in the game. So if you're looking to pick up this game, it is not short on resources. And one really key piece of the guide sort of comes from the Taz submission text, which is this enemy drop table here about who's going to drop health or blue horns or normal horns. The blue horns give you 5, so they're really good for farming currency and stuff like that. Now I'll go through a little bit of the start of the run, but we won't go through the entire route. So Quorbit does a 1-letter name, the absolute classic, to help it print that little bit faster, and then makes their way out of town. So there's this golden apple that you get coming up very shortly, and that's part of like a little trade sequence to get a sword upgrade. Quorbit mentions in the guide that it may be possible to skip this sword upgrade there, but you'd be sort of having a trade-off about doing less damage and everything like that. That's a golden apple there, and you can see it is a smidge out of the way. Much of this first dungeon is just clearing out enemies quickly to get doors to open here. Quorbit knows exactly which rooms you need to kill enemies in to open doors versus like hit a candle on the wall or something weird, so there's never like a wasted time killing enemies here. There's also a small aspect of trying to grind horns, which are the currency in the game, which will come up a little bit later. Now once Quorbit gets the battle axe, the axe is actually stronger than your base default sword, so you're just going to use that for the next couple dungeons. Quorbit gets the crystal at the end of dungeon 1, and as I sort of mentioned before, you'd have to walk all the way back out to the start of the dungeon, so it's often just quicker to die. The annoying thing about this is it restores you to full health after you get the crystal, so no matter what, you're always going to have to die from full health there. There's also little shortcuts on the world map, like cutting down trees there with the axe, so it's cool to see those implemented. Corbett does pick up an extra heart, and that's sort of a trend with this run. Corbett will be grabbing extra health and armor and sword upgrades here and there. You'd think it would be slow, but, well, it sort of is to an extent, but it provides a bit more safety, which lets you just take all the enemies a lot quicker. It's worth grabbing that heart because it just saves time over the run, and it's maybe like 15-20 seconds out of the way to grab it. Corbett will get the thunder magic here too. It's not overly useful, although it is really good for killing enemies pretty quickly. Now, Corbett also goes in here and gets some horns from this guy. I didn't mention it in the casual section, but with these guys, depending which secret you find, they may give you 50 horns like that guy does, or a completely different guy may just rob you and take your horns. So it's always a little bit of luck as to what you're going to get in that section there. Now, Corbett's farming up horns, but there's not really a whole lot to buy in this game. We'll see where he's going with that a little bit later. So anytime a blue horn drops like that, it's going to be really good, and Corbett got fairly good luck there. Horns will play a pretty large factor in this game. Also health will as well, so Corbett's wanting to maintain health for as long as possible. And if the enemies drop like the bread item, that's the health pickup there. In any rooms like this, you can use your shield to sort of bonk those arrows back, and that's a little bit of strategy that can be added to the run there. I also mentioned that your axe can actually pick up items if you slash it through them, so there's no need to run into everything. You just sort of slash at the bread and you'll pick it up. These bosses are pretty easy to take down. You would actually think that you can just sit there and take a whole bunch of damage from the boss, which is true. They're pretty unlikely to kill you, but you don't want to take damage too much because you'll get this little damage restore animation from the crystal there, and the lower you are on health, the longer it takes for the damage to tick back up. So it's sort of a balancing game there. Again, Corbett's just going to take a death to get back to the start of the dungeon. Now, deaths on the overworld send you back to the last save point, and that's going to be a key feature in this run here. They will take your horns away from you, so you just got to be conscious of that. But realistically, it's a lot faster than walking back there. You can buy this item called the wing feather thing, I think, and that will take you back to the last save point, but that's going to cost 30 horns anyway, so you might as well just die. Although the wing is used a little bit later on in the run. Dungeon 3 is much the same strategy, although I will mention the rooms start going dark here. You're intended to get that torch item to light up the rooms, but you can just go through normally without it anyway, so Corbett doesn't bother here. Probably one of the most cryptic parts of the game is this, taking the rope up the cliff there. You can sort of see, because the cliff is like flat at that point, that you can use the rope to get up, and that was an item that was got in the previous dungeon. So now that Corbett's up this cliff, you get the earth magic scroll. Getting the earth magic is actually mandatory because there's some blocks to progress through dungeons that you have to break through using the earth magic, but it's such a useful magic in terms of freezing enemies, because some enemies will like spawn on the screen, you'll get a hit in, then they'll despawn. It's a lot better to freeze those enemies and then retry. I also mentioned this other thing Corbett did, trying to go on that screen and then refreshing the screen. So sometimes enemies are just in your way and you need a refresh to get them out of the way. I'll just show that again quickly there, so you can see the enemies right in the way of where Corbett wanted to go down with the rope. Not really worth taking damage or trying to kill it, so you just refresh the screen. And that strategy is used all over the run. I think Corbett takes it to the extreme in this little section here. Refreshes quite a few times to make sure there are no enemies in the way getting past this little section. At this point, I think it probably would have been better to kill the enemy, but you just really can't know that without actually going into the screen and dealing with it properly. Since Corbett knows where all the secrets are, they're just going to go through and get a whole bunch of horns here, and we'll see why now. So by the time Corbett gets up to the sword upgrade, they have 150 horns, and then just south of this sword upgrade is a very special shop. Alright, so this shop is hidden in this map just by killing all the enemies, and it sells keys for the dungeon for 40 horns each, so that means Corbett can buy 5 keys here. This is probably one of the biggest improvements over the original run that I did, was actually buying a whole bunch of keys like this, because it saves Corbett exploring through the dungeons themselves and can just go through any locked key doors right away. There is an item which is similar to the Master Key in Zelda, which will just open any door in any dungeon, but that's not found towards the end of the game, so Corbett really has to buy the keys for now to get through quickly. It's such a cool strategy. So Corbett continues into Dungeon 4. Now there is still the need to farm some keys like this one from this room here, but more often than not Corbett has enough keys to get through without taking massive detours. This dungeon starts off with needing the earth magic to break that block there. So it is kind of similar to Zelda, where you need bombs to bomb walls and you run out, although luckily it's less common than Zelda, so it's a little bit less frustrating than that one. Corbett gets the canoe, and essentially that lets you go over shallow water like this one in the dungeon here. We'll get an item later called the ship, which lets us go over deeper water in the overworld. Corbett then takes care of the boss to finish out the dungeon. So one thing I should mention is when you beat the boss, the crystal takes a while to spawn up the top of the room, but what Corbett's going to do is sort of leave and then come back again, and then the crystal's literally just right there. Now at this point, Corbett is going to take a bit of a detour here to get the plate mail, so this just basically improves defense. Now on something like a Taz setting, you probably wouldn't need this, you just would go in and try not to get hit, but it definitely is worth it at this point to get it in RTA. Corbett in their notes mentioned maybe skipping some armors or shields to save a little bit of time, and that is something that I could see saving time in this game in the future. Then Corbett deals with Dungeon 5, which is pretty similar to the previous ones. Corbett does get the speed shoes item, which will speed up the character a little bit. So that's actually kind of cool. It's like, well, now movement's faster. So I almost wonder if there's a way to get the speed shoes earlier, but I'm not entirely sure whether that would be possible. Corbett then deals with the boss from the safety of the doorway, and then that's Dungeon 5 completed. Again, this doorway strategy is just so good because you can't get hit while you're in there. And it is pretty much at this point where Corbett starts walking out of most dungeons rather than death warping. My theory is when you death warp, it puts you onto 3 hearts, so that's a bit too low for Corbett. And then secondly, you still need a lot of horns to buy stuff, and dying does reduce your horns quite a bit, so you got to be careful. Corbett then takes on Dungeon 7, which has these annoying clam enemies. As much as I can tell, I'm fairly sure they're only vulnerable when they're moving towards the player. And then, yeah, Corbett is trying to freeze them where possible and then deal damage, but they're just really horrible to deal with. You also got these awful enemies that you have to sort of trigger from the wall. And you essentially have these Wizrobe clone enemies in this room here. Eventually Corbett will have to kill some of these to get a key out of a room, and generally it's best to freeze them so that you can kill them all in one cycle. Last up we have the boss fight. Now this boss fight is pretty random. So essentially when it goes, it'll pick one of the flames randomly to go into. And there's no way of knowing. I played this with save states before, and even like small movements leading up to the change can cause it to be in completely different flames. So yeah, this is one place where Taz would save quite a bit of time over RTA, but Corbett's just doing their best to check all the flames as quickly as possible. And the cool thing about not being kicked out of dungeons on boss defeat is that you can get the item a little bit later. Corbett gets the ship here, which will be useful for overworld travel. Corbett then sort of takes a path up here with a little bit of a detour to get the dragon mail. That does actually take quite a bit of time, so I feel like skipping that could save time in a future route. You can sort of go through our equivalent of the Lost Woods here. Not only do you have to take the right path, but you do have to take the right, I guess, up or down on each of those little branching paths on the right there, otherwise you don't get through the Lost Woods correctly. Now Corbett does go a little bit out of the way here for a sword upgrade, but in my opinion that would be worth it, because, well, you're dealing more damage and hence getting through all the enemies a lot quicker. Now that sort of the left half of the map is done, Corbett's going to set a save point down here. For this, like, setting the save point makes it so that every time you die or use one of those wing feather items, you go back to this save point rather than the starting point of the game. So it's going to be very useful for fast travel here. From here on out, the dungeons get similar but longer, but something really bad happens in this room, right there. That little crab enemy spawned on top of Corbett, dealing damage, and you might notice now that the character is just blinking. So that's a mechanic in this game, which is like rusting the armor, essentially. You can see the armor's flashing on the screen there. Essentially what that means is that Corbett now has extremely low defense and needs to go and purchase magic oil to get that armor back. It's probably the biggest mistake of the run, but it's kind of hard to call it a mistake as well, since the crab literally just spawned on top of Corbett. There wasn't really anything that could be done to avoid that, apart from knowing where it would be in advance, which isn't possible. So for this reason, I think it throws Corbett a little bit, and Corbett's a little bit more cautious during the rest of the dungeon, but still makes it through in the end without dying, which is very impressive. Now, not only does it lose time because you have to be more cautious, but Corbett now has to go out of their way to get meat and oil in the shop. So yeah, the oil will restore the armor. So if you're ever playing casually and that happens, just get the oil. I remember when I played this game casually the first time, I thought like the blinking was a power-up or something like that, so I just let it keep going, not realizing that my defense was completely tanked. Corbett does go out of the way to get the water magic here, but apparently based on the notes, this magic is literally only used just to refill your magic, not actually to get the water magic itself, so that's something that could be skipped in the future as well. And next we got another dungeon which Corbett takes care of very well. Now in the final dungeon you do have to get this item called the Golden Axe, which is pretty far out of your way, but the item is really quite good. So it's got the power of the strongest item in the game, but then the mobility of hitting with the axe and having that extra range, and you need this to beat the final boss, so you have to go ahead and get it. It's a shame that you can't like do more of the game after getting the Golden Axe, because that would speed up a lot of the other dungeons, but you do need to do the other dungeons to get to this one. Now the last boss, Death Adder, is a little bit anticlimactic. First of all, it's just a reskin of a previous boss, and then secondly you can sit in the doorway and use this strategy to cheese the fight. So yeah, pretty easy end to the run, all things considered. You might notice in Corbett's splits at the start, the summer best was like a 107 and it dropped to a 102 time for this PB, so it appears for that reason there may be more time to optimize in this run. But it is a pretty brutal game to run. There's lots of like RNG and inconsistencies and stuff, so getting a consistent run might not actually be that feasible. In fact, just to try for this video, I did a playthrough of the route with save states to get footage for the casual section, and managed to get about a 51-minute time. So in this route, that's some indication of how low it might go, but playing with save states, of course, you've got like enemy patterns acting more favorably because I was resetting if they didn't and stuff like that. So realistically, probably not a 51 with this route, but probably sub-hour would be achievable. So maybe we'll see somebody pick up the game and try it. There's definitely lots of room to still optimize in this game. But that being said, Corbett still optimized a whole bunch over my original run of this game and found some really cool routing in the process, so it was good to see this time come down. Right, now we're moving on to talking about the TAS. So yeah, this TAS has a lot of research in it, and it's quite a bit faster than RTA with a time of 30 minutes. And a large factor of that is not needing to worry about any defense items and manipulating the enemies to be exactly where you want them to be. Now, this is actually a game that I attempted to TAS way back in the day before the current TAS was ever published, and part of what put me off was the enemy spawning. So if you have a look at the map here, the enemies will spawn in, let's say, that pattern, and then if you try to reload the map, they might spawn in a completely different pattern. So they might spawn like that, or they might spawn like that, or they might spawn like that. Who knows? And even once you're in the map and some of them have started spawning, different movements can make them spawn differently. So it's not like in a TAS, you can basically just get into the map, get the spawn you want, and then run towards the enemy. You have to sort of manipulate it as you're running towards the enemies, which can be really weird. The other really funky thing about this TAS is that even if every single value in RAM is exactly the same, you may get different enemy spawning patterns. And I've never seen that in a game before, like not having an RNG value in RAM, but my theory is they're using like the register for RNG to do some of the RNG. So yeah, it's a weird game in terms of RNG. I was overly finicky about it because I wanted to absolutely optimize where the enemies were and have them in my path so that I could hit them quickly. The current published TAS does a brilliant job of manipulating RNG, but it does sort of accept once the RNG is good enough rather than sink hundreds of thousands into every records into making it absolutely perfect without a doubt. I actually had this same issue when TASing Golbelius, and that's why I sort of gave up on that one, I suppose, because I was trying to do like automated scripts and literally getting into the millions of re-records on a single screen. Alrighty, so yeah, we'll start looking at the TAS here. You can see just pretty much there's never going to be enemies in the way of you, and essentially what's happening is they're using the enemies for damage boosting forward where possible. So this is part of what frustrated me with manipulating RNG in this game. I wanted to manipulate enemies to spawn behind me to achieve damage boosts, and that just wasn't possible in some cases. The TAS found some also pretty cool movement tech. You saw slashing the sword into the dungeon, like collecting items this TAS does pretty quickly with some sword tech, so it was really cool to see. And you can see there just the RNG manipulation grouping the enemies up into big groups to kill them whenever you need to kill them to spawn an item. So this kind of RNG manipulation is sort of what put me off Tazzing this game in the end, because the RNG manipulation is very good in this Taz, but you can always potentially save a little bit more time, and I was always frustrated that it wasn't absolutely 100% perfect. Unlike... I don't think Zelda 1 has this issue as far as I know, or if it does, they've solved it with some automation. But yeah, and you can also see that we're collecting a lot of blue horns from the enemies, and that's going to farm a lot of horns to buy a lot of keys later on. So getting this sort of like an RTA is just not realistic at all. Blue horns are quite rare from enemy drops, and different enemies will drop them at different rates based on the table and the submission text of this Taz, but it is absolutely unfeasible to have 80 horns by towards the end of the first dungeon in RTA. We take care of the boss there and then use the exit room, enter room strategy. You can see slashing the axe before getting items does save a little bit of time there as well, which is something that I actually didn't know when I was originally trying to Taz this game, so cool to see that time save in there. Now, even in a Taz setting, we do actually get the heart upgrade still. Sometimes it is just good to take damage from enemies, like it's faster than trying to avoid that damage, so we might as well have the heart upgrade here. And we do get the golden apple for a trade coming up later, but this is in a very different spot to RTA. Now, normally in RTA, we would essentially have no horns yet to buy anything with, but what we're going to do in this Taz is farm up to 80 and then just buy 2 keys from the shopkeeper here. It is much faster to RNG manipulate blue horns than it is to go and actually get the keys as intended in the dungeon. We saw the RTA run do this a little bit, but it happens so much more in the Taz. Now, rather than going in the intended order like RTA does at the start, we're actually going to see Dungeon 3 coming up next here. And to my understanding, this is just to save a little bit of time on the overworld. You might also notice that these enemies have dropped keys. That is something that is absolutely not supposed to happen in this game, and there's something in the submission text about it that apparently was quite surprising as well. I don't know exactly how that works, that the enemies do drop keys there, but yeah, the Taz managed to manipulate it. So yeah, this is the exact bit in the submission text here. So yeah, I'm not really sure why it happens, but yeah, it's definitely not supposed to happen. But if you think about it, every single one of these key drops is potentially 40 horns in a shop trip, or going like several rooms out of your way in a dungeon to pick up keys. So I suspect this may be why Dungeon 3 is done before Dungeon 2 in this game, since now we've got a pretty healthy stock of keys to get us through a lot of the rest of the game. Alright, we take care of the boss, and since we haven't really taken damage, it's not going to take that long to fill up our health. We're only like 1 heart short. But then we do take a death warp out of the dungeon here. Farming horns is still quite important, so that'll be a factor, but you know, you might as well farm horns while you're trying to death warp. And although it's not used heaps in RTA, we do take a death on the overworld here. So that does impact on your horn counts, but realistically, if you're in a Taz setting, you can usually build those up pretty quickly by just getting blue horns over and over again. And with all these RNG manipulations, the submission text does mention some stuff about slowing down to do that. That is a factor. Sometimes you can't get perfect RNG without sacrificing a little bit of time, so there's always a trade-off to consider there. We then have Dungeon 2, and yeah, by having actual keys here, it saves us a lot of time of like just going around and taking longer paths through the dungeon. And we will get the Thunder Magic here, so we got the Gold Apple before. Weirdly enough, we actually can get key drops off the Whiz Robes here. So it seriously just completely breaks this game. It's absolutely wild to me that this is possible. And I've never seen a key drop off one casually, so it must be incredibly rare. Alright, pretty much follows the same as RTA now. We got Dungeon 5 with the speed shoes there. Obviously going to be a lot faster for movement through the rest of the game now. Now this boss is supposed to spawn projectiles around it, but literally just spin in circles with the sword and get rid of all of them. It's such a sick part of the Taz. And the other thing that's good about this game is after you've sword slashed, you can turn around. So actually, to get in the doorway there, like with that strategy to beat the bosses easier, you can sword slash and then hit up, and that turns you around without actually having to like move at all. So it's really useful tech there. And like obviously using that to spin in circles and hit the enemy really quickly is another application of it. And we do pull the same strategy as RTA here and set a save point down in this right section of the game, just so the warping is a little bit more efficient. Next up we have this boss, and you can see what I meant when I talked about it in RTA. Just knowing what flame the boss is going to come into helps quite a bit. And it can actually be manipulated, so it looks like this flame is constantly being manipulated into the bottom right to save any extra travel needed to get towards the flame. You can only deal one damage per cycle, I suppose, so sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to do this boss fight. Now, I will note that in this dungeon, we do get rusted armor, I suppose intentionally because it's a Taz. The only reason I can think of is maybe so that death warping is a little bit faster at the end of the dungeon, because, you know, we got so many hearts at this point that it does take quite a bit of time to die and get back to the start. In this Dungeon 6 we get the Ice Bell, which is a compulsory item to get through the game, and then take a quick death to get out. Now I don't have heaps more to talk about here since it really is just killing enemies efficiently. If you ever played this run casually, you'll know how satisfying that is to have the Taz kill those 3 eyeballs right away. And yeah, just the RNG manipulation on enemy patterns is really how this Taz comes in, basically twice as fast as RTA. But again, you can never really directly compare them because it's such a different thing to do a Taz than RTA like this. And then even just small things like in the final boss, the Taz doesn't have to hide in the door to deal with Death Adder, it just sort of does the damage directly. And that's pretty much the end of the Taz. So yeah, it's so impressive to see that this game has a really good Taz, especially since it's a bit obscure. So apparently Zobner was like playing this game since 7 or 8 years old and knew heaps about the route because of that, which was really cool to see. And yeah, the 3049 Taz is just, you know, very, very impressive. I had no idea the game could come down this far when I first played it. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you haven't tried Golden Axe Warrior, I absolutely would. Definitely one of the best hidden gems for the Master System. And thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy this video, subscriptions are always appreciated as it helps out the channel a whole bunch, and I should have a new one coming out every 2 weeks. Have a good one.